Hello, everyone. You're listening to CFCR 90.5. My name is Dean McNeil, and welcome to this, the third episode in our six-part mini-series entitled Adversity Meets Resilience. Thanks for tuning in. I'm a music professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and through this mini-series, I'm in conversation with award-winning author and historian, Dr. Bill Wazer. I'll be talking to Bill about past hard times in Saskatchewan and how during these hard times, people of our province have picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and moved forward with their lives. We'll also be playing some special musical selections for you with the hope that these songs will in some ways connect you to these stories of adversity and resilience. In our last episode, we listened to Mike Rudd's stunning Juno Award-winning original composition To Carmen, to Breveman. That's from his CD entitled Notes on Montreal. The song is a letter of sorts that Mike wrote to two fictional characters, one from a book, the other from a play that he was deep into at the time. If you want to check out that episode, you can find it on my Dean McNeil YouTube channel. The episode is entitled Emptied Land. Before we continue, I want to mention that Mike recently released a new CD entitled Solemn's Dance. It features Peter Bernstein, and you can learn more about that great disc at mikerudd.com. Keep in mind as well that buying music directly from artists during these hard times supports people like Mike in very direct ways. Today's episode is entitled Soldiers of the Soil. More on what that term means in a minute and why it's important to our history on the Canadian prairies. But first, let's listen to a piece of music composed by Pete Meekin as performed by the University of Saskatchewan Wind Orchestra, conducted by Dr. Darren Olerking. It's in 3 movements. Inspiration for the piece arose when Pete Meekin was reading letters written by soldiers to their loved ones back home. Pete then composed the piece to reflect their thoughts and feelings literally while they were in the trenches. The poems you will hear are written by 3 grade 4 students from Lake Ridge School here in Saskatoon as part of a Remembrance Day project back in 2016. In a live performance of this piece, the conductor often reads actual letters written by soldiers. Having children reflect upon our historical topic of today, especially in these tough times, is an important part of our Canadian heritage. It's the story that must be told and retold, lest we forget. The work is Letters for Home. The poem, A Soldier's Leave by Chaz Olerking. This first movement is Bittersweet Love Song.
Soldiers leave, they go away. In their hearts, they want to stay. Families watch them leave and cry. Soldiers wave and say goodbye. War isn't easy, it's hard. Families send their love in cards. Death is overtaking some. Soldiers' jobs are never done. Bodies, minds, and hearts are sad. They lost lives they never had. When conflict ends, what comes next? They may be home, yet no rest.
At this point, we'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Bill Wazer. This is CFCR's Adversity Meets Resilience series. And today our subject is going to be the First World War. It was the war to end all wars, and sadly, that was not the case. It is a time period which really defined in many ways everything to follow. The way the Second World War started had everything to do with the way the First World War ended. Largest loss of life in human history until that point through a single conflict of over 40 million people. And we're talking about the dates 1914 to 1918. Just made a lot of sense to include this in our discussion with Bill. So, Bill, where do we start when we try to come to terms with the First World War?
I know it's a big topic, Dean, and what I found, though, and I've got a personal connection to the Great War. I had a great uncle die at the Somme, and my bride, Marley, she had two great uncles die in Flanders. So I found that there are a lot of Canadians with connections to the Great War. But I think what a lot of people don't realize about Canada and the Great War is that we started out in a supporting or an auxiliary capacity. Canada was not expected to do much. We went to war involuntarily. When Britain declared war, we were automatically at war in August 1914. They thought it would be a quick war. It's termed an industrial war because of the new technology, the new weapons, and people thought it would be over in a matter of months. What happens in the case of Canada is that Canadians go into the line in the spring of 1915 in the Ypres in Flanders, and in the third week of April, the Germans launch an offensive. It's the first time that they've used chlorine gas on the Western Front. The Canadians remarkably hold the line, but they sustain terrible casualties, 2,000 dead. But Canada's nose is bloodied, let's put it that way. And from that point on, it becomes Canada's war, and Canadians fight to try and get this war over as quickly as possible so they could go home. So we take part in that Second Battle of Ypres in the spring of 1915. Then there's the Somme of 1916. We take Vimy Ridge in April 1917 when the French and the British couldn't take it. And then in the spring and into the summer of 1918, it's what's called the 100 Days Campaign, and it's Canadians that lead the way. I don't think it's fully appreciated, but we helped win the Great War through our valiant fighting through the spring and summer of 1918. It came at a terrible toll, though, Dean, because you've got over 60,000 dead. More died in the Great War from Canada than died in the Second World War. And in fact, it's estimated that 500,000 Canadians fought that war, 500,000, when our population at the time was only about 8 million. So it's a remarkable figure.
I, too, had family involved in the First World War. I think in our last episode, I had mentioned Uncle Matt, that gentleman that used to live with us when I was a very young boy, who was an infantryman in that war. And that sparked a curiosity in me in history, and in particular the two world wars. And there's all these things still in our very own community that are touched by that. If anyone ever goes to the University of Saskatchewan Convocation Hall, the names of people from our university that were involved in the First World War inscribed in Convocation Hall. One of the things I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, Bill, is what it would have been like as a Saskatchewan to be in the First World War. There's all these famous stories, like letters that have been preserved from infantrymen who are literally in the trenches, and they're writing to their loved ones back home, and the penmanship is absolutely beautiful, and their use of language is amazing. When I've looked at some of these letters, it's exactly the opposite of what I would have thought. If people's penmanship reflect their mood, it was almost the opposite with some of these letters.
That's right. Dean, it was called the Postcard War because there were 40 million, and that's not a slip of my tongue. There were 40 million pieces of correspondence exchanged between Canada and Europe, between Canadians and Europe in the Great War. 40 million pieces, and those are postcards, letters. So it's phenomenal, as you say, that correspondence. Just to put it in perspective for people listening in Saskatoon, though, about distinguished service, I think who comes to mind immediately is Hugh Cairns. and people might see his memorial statue at Kinsman Park. But striking about Hugh Cairns is that Canadians or people from Saskatchewan were what called citizen soldiers. And I'm going to put you on the spot here, Dean. Do you know what Hugh Cairns did for a living?
Now, was he the city's longest standing councilman? Is it that Cairns?
No, Hugh Cairns, the who died in the Great War. So he's got a memorial down in Kinsman Park by his soccer friends. But Hugh Cairns, who died in the Great War and won the Victoria Cross, was a plumber.
Really?
And all of 5'2" on a good day.
Well, and there are all kinds of stories about exceptional acts of valor by ordinary people.
That's right. And in terms of our topic today, there were exceptional acts of valor on the home front too. And I think that given what we're facing now during these troubled times, it helps put it in perspective. But a late historian friend of mine, Des Morton, said once, the war affected a great many people who never wore uniform. And that's what happened in Saskatoon and Saskatchewan. People did their bit. It was called, or it's come to be called today, virtual soldiering. So if you couldn't go overseas, what could you do at home on the home front? And it's quite remarkable what people did. They held tag days to raise funds for the Red Cross. There was food conservation. In other words, there's rationing. So lately there was this obsession with toilet paper. Well, it wasn't that way during the Great War, but there was food rationing. They had what were called victory gardens, so to reduce the demand for food in stores, people would have victory gardens in their backyard. And so they did whatever they could. Women stepped into the breach and fulfilled jobs that were normally held by men, but they're overseas, and so women moved into the workforce in different ways. So it's quite remarkable how this war not only affected Canada overseas and its position on the world stage, but how people looked at their daily lives in Canada. And it's been called the beginning of the interventionist state. You've got the Canadian government intervening to do things in the Canadian economy and Canadian lives that never happened before. And people willingly accepted this. They accepted the sacrifice over 4 years. And one of those sacrifices that I don't think that they expected would continue, Dean, was income tax, which was temporarily introduced during the Great War. And as you know, it's still with us every April.
Yeah, I just paid my taxes the other day.
Yeah.
Well, and there's so many places we could go with this conversation, Bill. Like when you're talking about women stepping up to do what were traditionally men's roles. And then, of course, when the war is over, the men who were running the country were expected the women just to go back to raising babies and cooking in the kitchen. And, you know, the suffrage movement of the women getting the right to vote, women's rights movement, nothing was the same after the First World War, including women's rightful place in society.
That's right. In fact, the irony is that the world we set out to save in 1914 was not the same world in 1918. It had been fundamentally changed. And as you mentioned, the role and place of women in Canadian society is just one example. I also wanted today to talk about kids and what they did during the Great War, because you know, their fathers, their uncles, etc., male members of the family are overseas. Their mothers, sisters, cousins, female cousins are involved in war work. What happened in Canada is that some very young men tried to enlist. Even though the age was 18, they would lie about their age to try and get in. And it's as if when you got accepted, when you did take your enlistment, and when you went and saw that recruitment officer, you were stepping over the threshold from childhood to manhood. And so, you know, a lot of boys grew up playing soldiers, reading military type books, etc., etc. So a lot of young men tried to enlist rather early, and some of them got away with it. Those that were too young to do that kind of curious adventure. They helped out in the fields. There was a great shortage of farm labor, and so what's happened is that both boys and girls are let out of school early to help with seeding and again with harvest. And if they helped that particular year, they got a badge that they wore in school, and that badge referred to them as a soldier of the soil. And it was a very proud thing they wore. But, this is another way of contributing to the war effort, because Canada is an important supplier of food to the Allied war effort.
So before we continue, Bill, let's take a moment to listen to the second movement from Pete Meekin's Letters from Home. This is a poem entitled What is Peace to Me by Ava Norman. This movement is The Trench.
What is peace to me? Soldiers protecting our country. Our country is honored. Remembering those who fought and sacrificed. Remembering our loved ones. A poppy worn proudly to honor. A world without conflict. Thankful for all I have. Hearts that are calm. Hearts filled with love. Freedom for us all. This is what peace is to me.
That was What is Peace to Me, a poem by Ava Norman from Letters from Home. And the piece of music you just heard was The Trench. One thing I would like to just bring to our listeners' attention is that efforts that you have taken to commemorate the war. Recently, we had a dedication of a bench on campus. I think it was not November 11th of 2019, but it was November 11th, 2018. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I had the privilege of chairing the University Great War Commemoration Committee, and in 2013, I got together with a group of alumni, faculty, staff, members of the larger Saskatoon community, and we decided to have 4 years of commemoration. A lot of events were focused around August 2014, the 100th anniversary of the start of the Great War. We decided to examine the war and its impact on Saskatoon and what Saskatoon contributed to the war from 2014 to 2018. And it culminated in that memorial bench, which is in a quad near the student residences on campus. So those activities have been recorded by the University Archives and Special Collections, and many of those activities, including talks, etc., can be accessed through the University Archives website.
I can't thank you enough and the committee for doing that. I walk by that bench from the building that I work in if I'm going to a meeting. I always take a moment to kind of reflect upon why it's there, what it represents. And I just think it's absolutely fantastic that you did that.
Okay, thank you. I want to, for our listeners, I'll tell you one last story related to kids and the Great War. It concerns an animal, and that animal is the gopher. And the gopher was, regarded as an animal pest affecting crop production, crop harvest. And in May of 1917, May 1st, 1917, Saskatchewan held its first Gopher Day. And every school district was asked to go out on May the 1st and to kill as many gophers as they could. The gopher was portrayed in May of 1917 as the enemy of production. He was almost as bad as the German Kaiser, and so you had school kids throughout this province going out on May the 1st and exterminating gophers, and they gave a gopher shield to the Charlottenburg School. It had killed the most gophers that day, and that shield today used to be on the walls of the Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan with the name of the school and Gopher Day and a gopher on it. So there's something strange in the Great War, another way of contributing or being involved in virtual soldiering.
Well, this is all absolutely fascinating to me personally. One of the things I find interesting, looping back to your conversation about letters, is how slow communication was, right? So if you would write a letter, if you're in the trenches in France in World War I and you write a letter back home, how long would it take, do you know, from that letter to be received and then for you to receive the response letter?
No, I don't know, but I do know that the Canadian Postal Service did work quite efficiently. But some of those letters were postcards that were quickly sent, and you actually would cross over things that didn't apply to you, but there were phrases that did apply to you because you couldn't reveal certain information. But as I said, it was known as the postcard war because of the amount of correspondence.
I think this is a great theme to link into what this miniseries is all about, which is basically to say in the middle of this pandemic that we're in, Saskatchewan is certainly no stranger to hardship, and that we have been through much, much tougher times in the past, and that we will prevail. And again, that's why we've titled this Adversity Meets Resilience. Perhaps now is a good time to segue into listening to the third and final movement from this piece of music by Pete Meekin entitled Letters for Home. This is a poem, We Will Remember, by Presley Freeland. The movement, In Memory.
Thank you to those who went to war. Our nation is now a peaceful place. War brought death, but death brought freedom, and freedom brought our peace. But is conflict ever really done? Does conflict help anyone? Thank you to those who went to war. We wear our poppies to remember. Sacrifice and honor and bravery and courage. But is conflict ever really done? Does conflict help anyone? Thank you for we are happy and safe. Freedom was bought for you and me. Grateful, free, we will remember.
This is Adversity Meets Resilience. Thank you, Bill, for talking with us today.
My pleasure, Dean. Thank you.
My name is Dean McNeil.